Hello, we're going to pick up our discussion of Black Skin, White Masks by Frantz Fanon. I think I'm going to cover the two chapters today in this video, Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. Chapter 2 being the woman of color and the white man, and Chapter 3 being the man of color and the white woman. So I think these are two really significant chapters, and I think there are some things that we need to be really clear about, like what Fanon is trying to do here and what Fanon is not trying to do. One is that Fanon is an anti-essentialist. This is part of his problem with the negritude movement, if you remember from the last video, sometimes lapsing a little bit too much into saying that people have like an essentializing feature, the soul of black folk or something like that. Some essence that follows and marks them as being black or what have you. So Fanon is not saying that all black people or white people are like this, okay? He's not making a totalizing gesture about the relationships between black and white people, especially in the romantic and sexual spheres. However, he is saying that it is a large enough phenomenon, not all but enough, right? Enough people think this way that it is worthy of philosophical investigation, and that part of the reason why they think this way is because of the conditions of colonialism that encourages them to seek humanity in whiteness and to value whiteness above blackness and other ways of being, things that are in the middle of whiteness and blackness, more ambiguous ways of being, whether it be mixed race or different class status. Because remember, in the very that chapter 2, Fanon discusses that money is white. Money is close to whiteness, right? So to have money alters your position, because if you're black and you have money, then you have some sort of social capital. You can't be sort of totally disregarded because you're able to leverage capital, literal capital, within your social relationships. So I think these are some things to really keep in mind. I think there are some moments in the chapter on women, on black women particularly, or women of color, as Fanon uses that phrase, that are a little bit misogynist. I think sometimes he is a little extra cruel in his dismissal of the novel that he discusses in that chapter. So he makes a long, and actually I think at the end of the day, a pretty astute analysis of this work about the black woman pining after the white man by Capiccia, Mayette Capiccia, the I Am a Martinican Woman. But when he introduces it, I think some of his sort of vitriol is part driven by his anger that black women think of themselves this way, and seek the social elevation and humanity through a relationship with a white man. But also some of it is, I think, as much as he takes the idea seriously to analyze it, his dismissal of what Capiccia is saying may be a little bit driven also by a misogyny, calling it a third-rate book and things like that. Now, though, notice he also draws very heavily on the theories of women, Anna Freud, for instance, and other works of literature. So it's kind of a mixed bag, I think. But his attitude, his dismissive attitude, I think could be a manifestation of misogyny a little bit. So remember, from the language chapter, the way in which we talk about things, how we talk about value, social relations, the language that we adopt, whether it be Creole or proper French or proper English or the black vernacular English and things like that, position us in a world and signal to others, because we present through our words and through our actions to other people as particular kinds of objects that are situated in the world amongst the social relations that are generated. And Fanon is interested in the situation generated under colonialism particularly, right? So that language is going to continue through these two chapters about romantic and sexual relationships, as white has now become the linguistic marker of humanity. So what whiteness and humanity are deeply intertwined with one another on the symbolic level that Fanon is interested in here. So on the one hand, we can see that the black man in the eyes of the black woman is degraded, that to associate with blackness, and the blacker or darker complected, the kind of worse, the lower one falls, and then whiteness is subject to humanization and lifts one up through association with whiteness toward humanity. That's the ideal. But remember, the idea will always be thwarted by the social conditions. This happens in the other direction as well. That, for instance, in the type of black man who seeks to conquer white women who go to the brothel right away in order to have sexual intercourse with a white sex worker, you can see there again the desire to sort of overcome or to express one's possession of humanity through the sexual act, either to enter into, in a somewhat literal sense, whiteness and thereby conquer it, or to wreak revenge upon the European that has displaced and marginalized them. So this sexual fetishization of whiteness on the part of the colonized results from the indoctrination, stems from their indoctrination into the idea that whiteness is humanity, and that through whiteness, by whatever means one can attain it, one will then achieve their humanity. But again, in both chapters, Fanon will talk about how the reality of the social situation will always deny them true acceptance. In the Woman of Color and the White Man chapter, Capacia herself acknowledges that when she finally goes to this social setting with her white master, she's not really accepted. She's kind of put out, and she's treated in such a way, not horribly, but with sort of distance and a level of disdain that she never wants to do it again, because again there the spell of whiteness is broken, and it's reinforced to her that she will actually never really be admitted, that no matter how closely associated with whiteness she becomes, she will not be admitted into the fold, actually. The same sort of thing in the chapter on black men, especially black men who have been sent away from the colony at a young age to be educated and have become really thoroughly Europeanized or indoctrinated into the European educational system. That leaves them almost in a kind of permanent exile. They don't feel at home in their quote-unquote native land. And here again you can see how native serves as a kind of a construct that is fluid, and it's one set up by the colonial power under which some people live, but when you are removed from that context and educated outside of it, to go back to it seems to you unnatural, that's not really where you're from, even though in the eyes of the white European that will always be sort of where you're from, because of the way that you present. In an ideological sense, the way that one thinks and the way that one has been socialized through education, they're not black because they've had a white cultural experience and socialization process through their education. On the other hand, their body will always manifest as an object, the outward expression of blackness, and so in the eyes of the other, they will always be black. And this creates, again, the fundamental contradiction that forms the fissure of trauma within the colonial subject. The way one has a difficult time being authentic. Again, that's why Black Skin, White Masks, as the title, fits so well, because the one feels oneself to be human, again associated with whiteness, through education and socialization, or in the case of the black woman, seeks to attain it, desires to have herself coincide with the object of humanity, which is only realized in the social sphere through the objective appearance of whiteness, but categorically are discluded from it by their very manifestation as an object in the social sphere. And so no matter how much a black man or woman feels themselves to be human, that is, to be white under the symbolic order that's been imposed by colonialism, their body and their physical manifestation to others in the way that they present in that context will never permit them full acceptance in the eyes of the other, who is the only one before whom they can justify themselves. That justification will always be sort of rejected. And so it creates the fundamental tension within the character of the colonized person that really inhibits their desire for authenticity, because it can be extremely difficult to coordinate the being for itself subjective feeling and thinking about yourself with the facticity, the outward objective manifestation of oneself in the world that is engaged and to which you are committed, and so on and so forth. And so the coordination between the for itself and the in itself, between facticity and subjectivity, or facticity and transcendence, again back to the language of bad faith, which is clearly playing a role here. The colonized subject is always at war with oneself, and at war with the social surroundings that has instilled the contradiction within them and not allowed them to pursue their being for itself in an authentic project. Because to be human, to even be admitted that you can pursue such a project autonomously and authentically, would be to breach the very category to which you've been relegated by the social system that lays the symbolic order over the black skin or the black body, to use some of that language that we find a little more strongly in something like critical race theory or identity formation. Theories about identity formation and so on. So those, I think, are the key sort of philosophical themes that are running throughout both of these sections, where, again, you can see the kind of intersectional flavored analysis that's happening here way before there was anything like intersectionality. Again, I think that intersectionality can serve as a useful heuristic here, but is a little anachronistic to apply. I don't think we need intersectionality. Of course, Fanon himself views his project here as a kind of existential psychoanalysis, and a lot of the examples that he's bringing out here come from his experience as a practicing psychiatrist. So he is drawing on his clinical experience to apply these theories into literature. One reason, of course, he wants to talk about literature is because the literature expresses the psychological phenomenon of the characters that it describes. So it presents us with an articulation of a psychological profile without violating like the confidentiality of using like real cases and so on and so forth. But the cases are backing up, that is providing Fanon with the empirical background and the kind of evidentiary support to read the literature in the way that he's reading it, because he's viewing in the literature a real manifestation and expression of the psychological problems that he's seeing in real patients and real people whom he's dealing with as they relate their experiences under colonialism, and the problems that arise, the neuroses, to use the psychological language, that arise from the conflict within their self, barred from an authentic project by the way that they present in the world, and it's conflicting with their ideation of themselves. Because again, humanity cannot be, under colonialism, under a racist regime generally, but under colonialism in the particular case of Fanon's analysis here, cannot be disassociated from whiteness. And so the neuroses arrives because whiteness has to almost become reified and fetishized as an avenue or a way to get at the humanity. One of the key things that colonial people are going to be striving for is to reclaim their humanity. Again, when we look at something like the Negritude movement and other kinds of black identity movements all throughout the 20th century and even up until today, it's a way to try to reclaim a humanity that has been denied under the ideological regime and the symbolic order in which one has been habituated and in which one has to navigate the world that's shared by other people who are also operating on the symbolic level with these ideological presuppositions and have been educated and socialized in these ways and so on. Black Lives Matter. The whole point of Black Lives Matter, in a way, is to reclaim the humanity of a people whose lives are disregarded often, who are not given the benefit of the doubt, who are treated automatically as guilty, as criminals, even when they're very young, that they don't belong in certain places. I mean, you look at cases, of course, like Trayvon Martin and so on, that he shouldn't be there, that he shouldn't be admitted into certain spaces that are coded, socially coded as white spaces, white suburban spaces, suburban parks, and so on and so forth. And so even to this day, we can see the same phenomenon that Fanon is describing in dehumanizing situations that exclude blackness from the category of humanity and thereby associate humanity almost exclusively with whiteness. So living under such a regime creates these kinds of psychological neuroses that Fanon is talking about in these two chapters. And of course, as a psychoanalyst, the ways that those are manifest within the psychosexual activities and behaviors of people is really important and is really telling, because sexuality is something that operates at the very sort of base level of people's existence. Our sexual orientation, our sexual proclivities, or the lack of them if you're an asexual person, really informs how we interact with other people a lot, whether or not we view them as friends or potential romantic partners, or we're attracted or repulsed in certain ways. I mean, the sexuality is really infused throughout a lot of our social interactions in an important way, from at least Fanon's point of view, but I think probably that there's a truth to that as well. Again, even if we don't identify ourselves as a primary sexual being, we still have to navigate a world in which people are sexualized in a pretty robust way. So I think that these are two really important chapters that touch upon key elements of racist regimes. The idea of the black woman social climber, who, again, I think Fanon has a certain level of kind of disdain and criticism of, but at the same time is sympathetic to, given the social context in which that person has to exercise their agency. And the way in which one can authenticate their agency in such a racist regime is through association with whiteness. And the same with the black male. Both the black male who seeks revenge upon the European, but also one who seeks avenue to whiteness through, again, similarly, the association with whiteness, through sort of conquering or possessing it. And again, you can see how these different things are inflected differently through the gendered orientation of the subject. So again, you can see that race and gender are affecting people in a way that is mutually informative. Right, you're sitting along both axes of identification and various sorts of oppression, and so it manifests differently in the black woman versus the black man, because their gender and race are interacting with one another when it comes to what axes of oppression are they lying along. Again, this is why I say that intersectionality can be a somewhat useful heuristic, because in one sense, intersectionality is not really about the identity of a person. You don't really talk about people having like an intersectional identity or something like that. Intersectionality is more geared toward the structure of it. Here, Fanon is interested in the identity and subjectivity, the psychological manifestations of these problems. What intersectionality is worried more about is the social structure, the so-called axes of oppression that operate in society that is racially and gender coded, racially coded and coded along gender lines. So people find themselves caught at the intersection of these various power axes within the structure. And that's really not what Fanon is talking about as explicitly. Again, I think sometimes it can be helpful to think about it in those terms, and you can see how these people are situated along those different axes and might be impacted in different ways. And those impacts manifest themselves psychologically within the subject in certain ways. That's more what Fanon is actually interested in, whereas the intersectional analysis actually would focus more upon the structure itself and the various sort of avenues through which power is exercised within a society, rather on and not emphasizing the subjective manifestation of that within the psychological makeup of the person, and certainly really not in their identity, so to speak, right? I mean, intersectionality is really not explicitly about people's identity, their personal identity, or that kind of thing. It's not about how they are identifying or how their identity is formed. It's more, again, it's just about how those axes of power operate on them, or how they are affected within those avenues of power, and so on. So that, I think, is the core sort of philosophical relevance of these two chapters that offer us kind of two sides of the gender coin here. There's not really a discussion, of course. This is heteronormative analysis, so there's a tacit assumption of heterosexuality in both of these chapters. I don't think that that's particularly unusual. Caribbean cultures and North African cultures can be relatively homophobic. Unfortunately, I've had some experiences with homophobia from Caribbean culture. There's still some legal restrictions in the islands against homosexuality and so on. That isn't expressly manifest here, but it is a kind of a notable absence. How there's not a discussion of any of those things here, that there's an assumed or tacit heterosexuality operating, and then we're really focused on relationships between men and women across racial lines. That still, though, is a very important thing, obviously, to examine and interrogate. And at the time of the writing of the book, I suppose it's not unusual to have that as the sole focus, but certainly I think work needs to be done in those other areas, and that is an oversight on Fanon's part to not consider that a significant part of the analysis there. So we do again have a bit of heteronormativity throughout these two chapters where that focus lies. But again, I think important work done to understand how colonialism affects, again, a significant part of the population, that this is not these are not uncommon ways of negotiating the gender lines in romantic sexual relations with other people relative to racial identifications and the power that comes with those identifications as we navigate the social sphere. So I'm going to pick up the next video, just continuing along into the next chapters. I hope you found this one to be informative. I think the book is getting just increasingly interesting, ever more interesting as we proceed through it. We'll continue to make some points about the role of language, because again, Fanon has flagged that as being foundational, so we'll see that crop up again and again, even after that formative first chapter. And I will see you all in the next video. Okay, thanks for watching.